But yes, good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak. I've had the great pleasure of working with Joe and the Belfast Climate Commission over the last few months, so it's great to kind of get into the detail of what this means going forward. So I guess a quick introduction to myself, adding what and where I work. So as Niall said, I'm a technical term of, or the technical job title is a Sustainable Finance Policy Fellow. So I am in academia, but we really work in applied research, which is useful because I probably wasn't the world's best student, but I have done a lot in terms of policy. And so it's great to work in the London School of Economics, a lot of leading experts on economics, finance, geography, and others, particularly in the Grantham Research Institute on climate change and the environment. And really, as Niall pointed to, where I've been really focusing my research interests over the last few years, and particularly the time I spent in LSE, is how do we get the right policy mix and public finance support to scale up different industries, and in particular, how can we finance a just transition as we go through the net zero transition. And I'll touch more on that later in the slides. Yeah, so we'll jump into it. So what we want to do is I'll start off with the warnings. As I'm sure many of you will be aware, hopefully aware, there's a climate or triple crisis of biodiversity, climate, and the social impacts of that. And just to give some of the scale of the challenge on that front, before moving on to a sort of opportunity, maybe a slight narrative and theory around the sustainable growth that could be a solution to the climate change challenge, and how the role of public policy and finance plays within that. And that's something Lord Stern, who some of you may be aware of, who's the chair of the Grantham Research Institute that I work at, has been promoting and researching for a number of years. Before moving on to, as I said, talking about the just transition, what is it? Why is it important? Why do we see it as a critical enabler of actually delivering a low carbon economy globally? Before moving it, diving down a little bit more detail into the UK, the net zero transition in Northern Ireland, and then I've tried to dip my toe into thinking about geothermal energy and a potential investment journey, looking at a few bits of research and case studies that I found. But caveating that all with being a kind of policy and finance, having expertise in policy and finance and low carbon transitions, not a total expert within energy, within different alternative energies, but getting there. And I've really enjoyed sort of learning and discussing with Joe and others the potential implications and opportunities for Northern Ireland. So we've got a problem, essentially. Some of you may know, even with current NDCs, and those are the national climate plans highlighting their actions, or each country's actions, their related targets, policies, measures, and aims, and basically their climate action plan. Even with all those commitments tallied up, and that's what they've committed to, we're still on course for global warming of 2.8 degrees by the end of the century. So what does that mean? And that means, more flooding, extreme weather events, crop failures, and so really we need immediate action with accelerated action now to 2030 to kind of close that gap. And we need peak emissions across a number of economies, major economies in the globe, within the next few years, moving towards net zero by 2050 for most countries. So it's pretty stark at the moment. There has been progress, but the recent IPCC report, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report in April, highlighted that to stay within that 1.5 degree or 2 degree temperature rise would require rapid and deep emissions reductions across all sectors. So that's scaling up renewables, scaling down fossil fuels, but also investing in alternative energy sources and other measures as well to reduce energy demand. I think we can all be aware that this has been further exacerbated, the drive and need for this, by the recent energy crisis globally, and the impact that has on consumers, but also highlighted our sort of unsustainable reliance on fossil fuels on a number of different fronts. So while there has been a lot of commitments, as I said before, in terms of the NDCs, emissions have still continued to rise, albeit at a slowing rate. And it will almost be impossible, according to the IPCC, to stay below that 1.5 degree threshold with no or limited overshoot without massive scaling up of climate action. And so the report emphasized substantial reductions in fossil fuel use, but even ramping up things like energy efficiency, electrification, and rapid uptake of low emission energy sources, including alternative energy carriers like hydrogen. So quite a significant challenge. But to move on to a slightly more, to give what is the solution? What could the journey be out of this? And the UK has claimed to have decoupled its carbon emissions from growth. And within our institute, the Grantham Research Institute, we've long advocated a sort of sustainable growth story that doesn't, which isn't coupled to increased carbon being pumped into the atmosphere, but it needs significant investment in the short term, innovation even more so in the long term, and eventually moving to low carbon economies quite quickly over the next 20 to 30 years. So we need a significant amount of investment, but there is a powerful growth story here as well. There's, as I've listed here, strong job opportunities from this. There's economic multipliers, and of course, there's the health benefits associated with, quality jobs, but also with the air pollution improvements, which we're seeing more and more evidence of the negative health impacts of that. And just to kind of counter some of the narrative you might get within the media at times, I think we need to be speaking about this in terms of net benefits. The costs, yes, there are costs to investment, as there is with any investment, but the net benefits to the population in terms of social and health benefits, as well as sort of economic benefits, are significant, but need to be managed correctly to deliver on it, because you may even hear the term there'll be a smooth transition. I don't think there's ever been a smooth transition of this scale. There will be dislocation of work, changing relative prices, but we have to be mindful of that and develop policy and financial support for those impacted communities, so they get the right training, skills, and relocation when necessary. And this is really starting to touch on that just transition point. How do we do this transition in a way that is just and progressive socially, in the sense that it corrects for potential inequalities that we might have already in the system? But as I've said, the investment need on a global scale is massive, 2 to 3% of GDP. But there are, recapping, of course, there are huge benefits: GDP growth, employment opportunities, additional tax revenues that sometimes governments forget about as well as those health benefits. I think with the energy crisis right now, cost of energy crisis right now, there's never been a stronger time to make the case for make the case for alternative energy sources, including renewables, which have seen rapid cost reductions over the last 10 years. And so those as alternatives become even more compelling economically, as well as what is needed from a decarbonization point of view. But just to recap some of that high level messaging again, there's a large increase in investment needed at a global scale. There's huge potential social benefits, including driving productivity growth, which is something very compelling to many governments, particularly in the UK. But the majority of the investment will have to be from the private sector. But that is not to say that public finance doesn't have a key role and sort of emerging, or has a key role in terms of how it's deployed effectively at innovation times, but also supporting and leveraging in private finance to be invested into these low carbon sectors, technologies, and business models that we need to be scaled. So on one final point, when I did these slides 6 months ago, I talked about a low interest rate environment that would allow for easier borrowing to invest in this. I think given the inflation rates we're seeing and the response of central banks raising interest rates, that narrative is getting challenged, but I still think that there's potential for investment still produces returns. even if the interest rate environment is not quite what it was 6 months ago. There are a few problems in the sense historically investment growth has been on the decline, hasn't really rebounded as much as we thought in 2021. There's been a persistent gap in infrastructure spending in both developed and developing countries. But as I kind of emphasized again, there are significant opportunities for scaling up sustainable investments, and the financial sector is waking up to this. And I'll touch on this a little bit later on. But we have things like GFANZ, which is the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, which is essentially a huge grouping of financial institutions. We have about 130 trillion assets under management. And they are all committed to net zero transition plans, essentially. And so for net zero transition plans, you need net zero investments. And so we'll touch on that a little bit later on, but we need to be building those pipelines of net zero aligned or low carbon investments so that this 130 trillion assets under management that apparently is ready to go can be deployed into those investments. So there's opportunities there, but there's work to be done in terms of policy and getting the right financing conditions, which I will come on to. So just to finish on this kind of sustainable growth point, we had a number of major events in 2021. It's a critical decade really to 2030 where we really need clear action, and you'll see in a lot of the financial sector and real economy net zero transition plans, they all have to have a 2030 interim target, even if they set net zero by 2050. And that's important, but also difficult. I think as the diagram shows here, we have increased infrastructure, GDP growing, which is improving, improving development across the emerging economies and developing economies. And we've also got increasing urban population. These are pressures that inherently would suggest more carbon emissions. And at the same time, to meet Paris targets, we've got to reduce carbon emissions. So we've got to find a way to deliver that development, as we are doing, that is decoupled from carbon emissions. And we think it is possible, but again, you need sound policy to sort of transform those investments into projects and programs, and the right kind of finance, which I'll kind of touch on later as well. Getting the right kind of finance into these projects is essential to help them scale and be replicable. So as I touched upon in my introduction, a lot of my research currently is focused on financing the just transition. So I guess what is the just transition? And we see it as a key part of the solution to delivering a kind of low carbon global economy. It first really came to prominence in the Paris Agreement. So many people might not know this, but it was referenced. And if you're Paris aligned, technically you should be taking, if you're an organization or a business or an economy that says you want to be Paris aligned, a key part of that is a consideration of the just transition. And essentially, if we're working on the assumption that we do want to get to a low carbon global economy, the term just transition just means designing and delivering climate action so that it tackles existing inequalities and delivers social progress. It has its inception within the world of work and workers and trade unions, and the International Trade Union Confederation has led a lot of fantastic work in sort of defining and measuring just transition from a worker's point of view. But it is also important that it extends the supply chains, obviously, workers in those supply chains, but also impacted communities and regions. We have in Europe, for example, there are very coal dependent regions. They have to be managed through the transition as to minimize those social risks to those sort of economically dependent regions. And at the same time, we may have communities that are affected within those regions as well that need to be supported. An additional lens that we'll add to this is to add to this all the sort of complexity of this and managing transitions is the place element. Different places will have different transition risks and opportunities, as well as kind of core competencies within this place. And so the transition will be different in Johannesburg than what it will be in Belfast, but they still need to go through a transition in a way that it supports the local economy and doesn't, further exacerbate inequalities. So, I mean, this kind of came my boss, I guess, Professor Nick Robbins, really started to work on this sort of finance and the role of policy in delivering the just transition post the Paris Agreement 2015, as he started to notice kind of real political and social risks to not allowing people to be a core part of the transition to net zero or low carbon economy. You've got the example here of President Trump loves coal miners as a sort of populist way to help to sort of say that you're going to support coal jobs, even if even if it is not economically viable. And the reason is you have to make support people through the transition, not just divest or pull the rug out from underneath them in terms of policy support. A similar example with the Gilets Jaunes movement in 2018, where a fuel charge was brought in, and unsurprisingly, people have a fairly, while the climate crisis is important to people, you can't pull out their means of living, as this quote kind of shows. So you need to design the policy and climate policy with people at the heart of it, from our perspective, for sure. And so, we have President von der Leyen here. Or what I'm trying to say with this slide is there's been an improvement, and policy is starting to wake up to this. They got the quotes here from Ursula von der Leyen, but also President Biden, who, I think even if you look at a lot of his green growth programs, a lot of it is entrenched in the opportunities of good quality, unionized green jobs. And the UK as well, at the recent COP26 negotiations in Glasgow, signed a declaration supporting the conditions for a just transition internationally, and that was alongside 16 other industrialized governments and the EU. And that looks at principles of supporting workers, social dialogue, economic strategies, decent work, supply chains, and reporting. So the policy is getting there. And as I've sort of said, the transition could bring significant economic and social benefits. I think there's 100 million jobs laid out here, but it has to be managed well, and policy has to support that. So that means, yes, supporting development in local regions, allowing them to avail of the opportunities of green growth, but also managing social risks of industries and communities that are dependent on these. And if you don't manage these risks effectively with proper policy and support, and it is poorly managed, it could result in, or is very likely to result in, stranded assets, but more importantly, stranded workers and communities. Essentially, if you're from a coal producing region in South Africa, and you're given no support, but the coal region or the coal plant is decommissioned and shut down, how are you supported through that? And if you're not, it's going to probably lead to political backlash, as we've seen emergence of before. So for this reason, we see it as a critical enabling factor of net zero and delivering a low carbon economy globally or at a national level. And as I think also investors are now starting to wake up to this as well, in that they've signed up to net zero targets. They're looking for net zero projects, as I said before, but they also need to figure out how they can manage those social risks through their own transition finance, i.e. how they would support a BP or slightly smaller fossil fuel producing organization or fossil fuel reliant organization to ensure that workers, communities are supported through the transition as well. Otherwise, we risk the net zero transition not being delivered, or being delivered in an inefficient manner. So there's a critical role for investor leadership, and a lot of my work has been working in something called the Financing the Just Transition Alliance, or the FAJITA. Insert Mexican spicy food joke here. My professor usually does it. I try to avoid it. But it really is a good grouping of kind of financial sector leadership alongside academia, like ourselves, and also place representatives, so like core climate commissions in Belfast, Edinburgh, and Leeds at the minute. So, and what we try to look at is, okay, how can financial institutions embed the just transition within their climate strategies, those net zero strategies that I referred to, but also in their transactions, their operations, and looking after even their own workforce is important. So just to finish on this point, we try to think about unpacking that scope of the just transition is, workers, as I said, where the kind of was the initial where the inception of the terminology came from, but thinking about the spillover effects for communities, respecting the rights and impacts of those involved. And there are vulnerable communities as well that are dependent on fossil fuels, and we have to manage them through that transition. Consumers very much in the focus right now, particularly with the rising energy prices and reliance on spiraling fossil fuel prices across the globe, essentially, and the impacts of other foods, I think, or other products we'll see as well in the next few months, with food prices potentially going up and inflation coming across a number of different or being driven by a number of different factors. How do we support consumers through that to make sure that they get adequate access to sustainable services and remove those barriers, make it the easy choice? It's a difficult challenge for policymakers and for companies. And then there's citizens getting involved in sort of social dialogue of it. And I think this diagram on the right hopefully paints a picture of the key part of understanding place and the kind of specific characteristics of a place. So in the northeast of England, they have a huge offshore wind capacity. And so from there are large opportunities to reindustrialize that area and bring jobs and training. But equally, if you're in, again, using the South African example, a huge coal dependency there for their economy, how do you manage them through those risks and give them as much opportunity as possible? These are challenges within each place. So moving on to the more specific UK net zero journey. As I've said, there, some of the politics has moved forward in some cases, and in some cases backwards. But we have seen, recent commitments from China. USA, with the current president, is committed to reducing greenhouse gases. Let's see how that goes with the next election, but hopefully that they can stick to that. And the EU has taken a lot of leadership and has actually launched a just transition fund mechanism as well, which is I'd say, the kind of pioneering model of policy support for more impacted regions from this transition. So there's a lot of strong movement internationally. The COPs I've mentioned, there's lots of them, one every year. Last year in Glasgow, next year in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. But in the UK, to be fair, has quite a strong record in climate change policy. And the net zero strategy last year laid out the expected path to decarbonisation as part of something called Carbon Budget 6, which is shown in the diagram to the right. And essentially, they have the Climate Change Committee as well, which is their advisory body, and they have quite a good setup in terms of policy commitments, as they were at legal commitments, in the sense that they were the first government to set a legally binding target. And now they've got a strategy which identifies the key sectors, identifies the targets. Even though I worked on this strategy, I think maybe there's a little bit to be desired in terms of, okay, how do we actually create the right policy conditions and financing and support conditions to sort of meet the investment challenge? And the investment challenge is significant. We need investment to meet net zero, to grow fivefold by 2030, from 10 billion a year we have now to about 50 billion 2030, and actually peaking in 2035. And to do that, unfortunately, can't really just be left to the market, and never really has been, to scale up markets like this. There are considerable benefits to doing this. There are, as I've said before, there's a strong local dimension, and you need to develop place-based strategies that feed up into this national target. But you need to create the right conditions to scale these markets up and to meet that sort of investment challenge. And to get those right conditions, it needs policy, right public finance, and the right sort of support, and to get private finance in there. And that's what this diagram, I guess, is kind of trying to show. So on the left-hand side, we have the kind of emerging and kind of nascent technologies, and like green hydrogen, modular nuclear, and the idea of how you provide grant support for that to allow the research and development to take place, or the project planning to take place. That's kind of what I'd call frontier technologies, and we really want to move them from left to right, essentially, on this diagram. So, but there also are proven technologies, like with energy efficiency. A lot of the technology that we would use in energy efficiency is very much proven, but we need to support the business models to make the economics stack up for households, but even on a sort of more at a wider level in terms of government financing as well. So for things like hospitals and public assets as well, the economics don't totally stack up, or the payback periods are slightly too long. So you need revenue support models or public finance support to make those kind of what I call frontier business models work. The idea then being that all these sectors and technologies that we need to reach scale and reach sort of be capital markets ready can sort of replicate the journey that offshore wind has gone on for the most part. I know there's kind of floating offshore wind, which is probably still in that kind of probably further to the left there, but and the idea being, if you get the right mix of policy support, public finance support, you can each of these sort of sectors can go from that on that sort of investment maturity journey from left to right. So before I move into the net zero transition in Northern Ireland, I wanted to give due process to the Irish Climate Action Plan. Obviously, as now said, there's been a lot of action and a lot of progress on the island of Ireland, and I've been trying to keep abreast of it, though I am unfortunately a little bit too UK centric at times, just geographically where I lived and having worked in the UK government. But I think from my recent learnings of the action plan, there is a lot of progress there. The energy mix ambitions by 2030 are huge, and I think what's interesting from my point of view in terms of how do you get that right mix of finance or incentives with public policy, the national retrofit plan, and you can see here that they want to reduce emissions in buildings by 44 to 50% by 2030, includes some low-cost loans with blended grant to kind of make that economics of those retrofit and energy efficiency measures for buildings stack up a bit more. So interesting to see how that goes. There are a lot of different programs trying to be set up now across Europe and others to kind of deal with this problem of making energy efficiency models more profitable, I guess, for people. So it'd be interesting to see how it goes. The UK has been littered with, I guess, policy program failures of this sort. I think the Green Homes Grant is the most recent one. So it would be great if this one had a success, and there would be lessons that could be learned in Northern Ireland and the UK as well from it. So moving on to the net zero transition in Northern Ireland. Again, similar to Ireland over the last few years, there's been a real ramping up of policy detail and action and strategies. Firstly, with the path to net zero energy strategy. I'm sorry, I'm getting a little bit of background noise there. Just if you can go on mute, yeah. I'll finish. I won't take too long. Don't worry, we'll have questions soon. Then we have the actual action plan, which sets out a number of clear actions over the next few years, which is great. I think from anyone who's worked with policy strategies before, it's always heartening to see clear actions at the back of it. And in the green growth strategy, which I wasn't aware of until Joe flagged it up to me, but essentially from what I understand and a quick read of it, essentially it's looking to integrate decarbonisation and environmental principles into policy making. And a lot of ministers from across the parties have signed up to it. So there's a lot of momentum in this space, a lot of support. I presented to the Belfast City Council before, and a cross-party group of representatives were very supportive. So I think, touch wood, it could be one of the few issues that there's a lot of agreement on in Northern Ireland, and that's a good thing. So what are the key sectors? I think, these strategies touch on it, but obviously the energy system is huge. We get a lot of offshore wind at the minute. I think there's potential for more onshore wind. Not totally familiar with the project planning process for that, but having spoken to the Strategic Investment Board, I believe there is a lot of potential for that, but also for the kind of new energy sources. Green hydrogen is very much flavour of the month everywhere, including Northern Ireland. So it'd be interesting to see how those applications can be scaled. And then, of course, why we're here today, geothermal. Transport is a big one. Having grown up in Belfast, the cities aren't really built for public transport that much anymore. So we need to be thinking about how we put EV charging infrastructure in place and how we get the models to make that work. And energy efficiency of buildings is a big one. And I think there's some great things we could do early on with the Northern Ireland Housing Executive, but I won't get into that too much now. The other point I'd like to say that isn't touched upon as much in the strategy is, and it's not because it's not a massive investment challenge, but touches on that agricultural, Northern Ireland's a very agricultural economy, is thinking about natural capital models, how we can incentivize conservation and support of some of our natural capital, and also green infrastructure in cities. I think we're not talking about huge amounts of money here, but it'd be nice if we can build models that support the conservation and people, and you can get investment into it. Because I'm a big supporter of those sorts of models, and we're seeing in the UK for sure some new models of emerging that, for example, you can get repayable finance for outcomes into protecting forestry and other things. Should have made a note of that before I started talking about it. But to make this net zero finance a reality, we need to see, as I've said, a 5-fold increase in net zero. We have that unprecedented demand from banks and financial institutions, but we need to kind of build the pipelines and bring them closer together, these two worlds, i.e. the local climate or the local climate projects and the institutional investment and investors. How do we bring those two worlds closer together so that you can get that funding flowing in to those local projects, including geothermal projects? And really you need, having worked in something called the Place-Based Climate Action Network, which works with Leeds University, LSE in Edinburgh, and related local climate commissions, we think there needs to be something that fills in what we call like the missing middle, a sort of strategic mechanism to connect the supply and demand. And really it's a hub. We call it a hub, but essentially it would be resourcing for people who live in the place, know the area, but can actually bring together these sometimes disparate stakeholders to build those pipelines. And then you start to get projects that are specific to the place rather than what is dictated by national government. So we were going to be trying to do some pilots of that in the coming months, potentially in Scotland, potentially in Northern Ireland. I'm currently working on a project with the UK Climate Cities Investment Commission, the CCIC, which is working with BEIS, the business government or the business department in the UK government, to look at, okay, how do we build capacity in local places to then do the pipeline development, the project preparation that is needed to then eventually encourage investment into these low carbon projects that we need, and what is needed at a place base, or what is needed within that particular region. So there's I mean, from a policymaker's point of view, and I think the diagram on the right I've taken from the pathway to net zero energy strategy for Northern Ireland. Huge benefits to the people of Northern Ireland if they get this right. Fuel poverty is higher in Northern Ireland, as far as I understand, compared to even other regions in the UK. I think primarily due to our reliance on oil tankers out the back of a lot of our house for our heating and the way that we heat our homes. So there's a massive opportunity there, and obviously that would have an economic stimulus effect as people are spending less on their energy if you get that right. There's new business opportunities, but also there's just simple quality of life indicators. I mean, this is something everyone wants: improved outcomes, better access to green spaces, and then there's the economic opportunities. Where's my fact? That was good. I was the Construction Industry Training Board said for improving the building fabric energy efficiency of buildings in the country will require 12,000 workers to be trained. So if we can do that in Northern Ireland as well, there are huge job opportunities there. And I think then you'll have no problem getting investment from the UK government and even EU funds, which I think Northern Ireland can still avail of, to support these projects. And so maybe Northern Ireland can even become an exemplar. And I'm actually working on a proposal for a sort of just transition bond raise, which could be done in Northern Ireland because it's got a very supportive or very what's the right word? It's like a nice small region with a lot of policy concentrated in one area, which could make a lot of these financing solutions a little bit easier to get off the ground compared to slightly bigger regions. So I just wanted to finish off in the last 5 minutes by trying to dip my toe into thinking about geothermal energy and the investment conditions that might be needed to deliver it in Northern Ireland. So as I said, I've had the pleasure of chatting through this with Joe and learning, having grown up in Northern Ireland and Belfast, that we actually have a lot of geothermal energy potential. I think you even told me, Joe, that the Lyric actually uses geothermal cooling. Correct me if I'm wrong on that after, for sure. But I started up by looking, okay, so how do you get projects like this off the ground? What has been done internationally? And I found an interesting piece of research by the Climate Policy Initiative, who are well-respected, research institution. And the story of geothermal energy is a story of a lot of alternative energies. Long lead-in period before you start to get returns, and in that lead-in period, it's risky. You need that early public exploration. Someone needs to pay for that. Usually it's not the investors. You'd have to have a pretty progressive investor to take the risk to actually to sort of pay for the exploration. And then you probably need policy support to ensure revenues over the project timeline. And then there's it referenced differentiated support, providing all the survey data, all these things to give more assurances to investors. And then you need that long-term cost debt and lowering that financing cost and providing risk mitigation that will eventually and should allow investors the confidence to come in after you've gone through that first phase. And I like the last bit, which is government guarantees for off-takers of the energy. That's good. I think there's a lot of potential in the UK government right now who are looking at guarantees through their UK infrastructure bank and how they could support projects like this. Political risk mitigation tools, more developed in country context, but maybe some people who've dealt with politics in Northern Ireland think we do need that risk mitigation tools as well. And then technical capacity policy. Apologies if there's anyone from political parties on the call, I doubt not. But technical capacity support is really important as well. And that kind of relates again to that local climate finance hubs point that I was referring to before. So in Northern Ireland, it's I'd say it's in the R&D phase. Happy to be told I'm incorrect on that, but it's in that kind of costly and risky phase. Good news is in that action plan, from what I understand, there's a demonstrator project getting off the ground. I think Joe had referred to me a few other demonstrator projects that are happening on the island of Ireland as well. And so grant is being provided for those proof of concepts. So you can take those first steps, dealing with those high upfront sort of CapEx costs. And eventually the idea being that this is where I very roughly thought maybe geothermal energy in Northern Ireland was, again, correct me if I'm wrong, but eventually you can get to the point where you get through that R&D phase, that exploration phase, you prove that geothermal energy can be deployed. You start to scope out where it can be deployed within different businesses and buildings in Northern Ireland. And then you start to give assurances to investors, and you can get that kind of institutional patient capital that you might get from pension funds to come in because they can invest over 20 to 30 years, and perhaps a kind of public finance institutions like the UK Infrastructure Bank, who have a climate change objective and levelling up objective, which essentially, from my perspective, is combined. That's just transition to support this sort of thing. So I wanted to just finish with bringing you on the journey that I went through over the last weeks of looking at different models that have, I guess, worked so far in a developing country context. Geothermal energy in Kenya seems to have been quite successful. I was on a panel with someone from the African Development Bank and someone from who was involved in Kenyan policy making. And Kenya is a real leader, a pioneer in deployment of renewable energy. Don't quote me on this, but I think it's over 90% of their energy comes from low carbon sources, including a lot from geothermal energy. And I found evidence of the Climate Investment Fund had played that sort of grant de-risking role for this project in Kenya, which allowed, and they also offered sort of covered the default risk, i.e. through a guarantee, which then allowed the African Development Bank to come in, the government to put in some money, and then actually some private investors as well. And they also provided that technical assistance support. So you can see those different factors coming together to get this this sort of geothermal capability off the ground in Kenya. And I really searched to get some evidence or some details on their current capacity, but I know they want to increase it to 5,530 megawatts by 2030. I don't know right now what it's at, but you can see that there's a lot of learning on how they structured that. And finally, for my final slide, is a bit closer to home. There's the geothermal energy project in Cornwall, which many of you will be aware of. And again, it's a similar story. Grant funding, I think, for that early, slightly riskier phase. The council gets involved from a government point of view. They were smart enough to get some of the ERDF funding before it probably isn't available to them now. And then they got institutional investors involved because they give them the insurances to come in. And now they've gone through that kind of phase one, the testing, measuring the benefits, kind of the feasibility phase, and now moving into actual what they're calling phase two, which is, you know, the actual power plant and energy for homes. So perhaps there are lessons from slightly further afield and slightly closer to home, but generally the process remains very much the same. And with that, I will stop and thank you for listening to me drone on. And if you don't have any questions for now, you can email me here and I'll hopefully share the slides after, but I'll stop there